As far as consumers are concerned, what should it mean to a user or consumer when we say digital property rights, when we get so excited about it?
Today, what is the property of that is important? And it is no longer the property of our hands, it is the property of our mind.
Yat Siu is the co-founder and chairman of Animoca Brands, built as the gateway to altcoin exposure with investments in more than 400 Web3 companies. Yat is also a pioneer of digital property rights.
I would argue we're at an era where it's tokenize or die, certainly in the next coming years.
Could you borrow in an on-chain market with collateral which is far lower than we are doing right now?
You don't include people into the financial ecosystem by asking them to over-collateralize. You're taking a chance on them.
DeFi is so degen right now, unless we abstract that complexity, even crypto folks, less than 10% are on-chain.
The best hedge towards AI is actually to
Yat Siu, welcome to Alpha Unhashed.
Thanks for having me. Great pleasure to be here.
Yat, I've really liked your vision and advocacy of digital property rights. As we come to the end of 2025, what do you think? Where are we in terms of how you would have envisioned digital property rights, and where we should have been, and what are the real gaps out there?
Well, I mean, certainly when we started talking about digital property rights back in the early days with, CryptoKitties and Sandbox land and the Metaverse, we certainly didn't think it would be looking the way that it does right now. But it's not to say that it's a bad thing. It's just, as you know, when it comes to an entrepreneurial journey or just building anything, it never ends up building and developing in quite the way that you imagined. But it's still sort of big and beautiful in its own particular ways. So a couple of things, right? One of the things that we were certainly expecting is that at this point in 2025, there would be a lot more consumer adoption into the entire digital asset space around digital property rights in particular, and that there would be a stronger understanding more broadly as to the meaning of what ownership really means, right? And I think those theses still hold true, but I think the pace of adoption hasn't been quite as big as we'd like it to be in the retail consumer side of things. And I think that's somewhat related to the fact that users don't have a true understanding what property rights are, whether they're digital or analog, right? That's kind of one issue. As to why do I hold this property? Why does the government or the legal system work in this function? Many of them don't even think about it. Often we still have conversations with people who think that, the fact that there's a house that's physical is why property rights work, which is not at all why it works. But it's something that you can touch and feel, right? It's like my car. I own it. I can drive it. And therefore, you feel like it is your property. But of course, the security of the property comes from the fact that there's a government that gives you the legal rights attached to this, right? And so sort of that stretch is the one thing that I think a lot of people aren't fully understanding. But I would say the area of adoption that happened very much more rapidly, and especially when you consider what's happened in the past, is around the institutional adoption. So the institutional adoption of digital assets and crypto broadly has been, in particularly this year, and really starting in 24 with the BlackRock sort of ETF, really sort of accelerated in a big way. And so I would say that the last year and a half to 2 years has been very much an institutional adoption, and the recognition of the security of property rights from the institution has become much more vital in their thinking. Basically, Bitcoin is a hedge to the financial market, for instance, or they look at ways in which you have an asset that can't be easily diluted, right? Particularly when it comes to protecting against QE, as an example, right? So it's become kind of a digital gold, as you will, right? And I think while Bitcoin in particular does move according to the markets as of late, precisely because of its institutional adoption, meaning that it is much more affected by institutional sentiment than it was before because of the holdings of institutions of this asset. It is also clear that institutions understand it better, right? They look at it and say, okay, this is my property, or this is a property right of some sort that has meaning. In some ways, whether this is like, another commodity or another real estate or different type of sort of assets that you could have. And so it's reached that level of understanding. So I think right now we've got institutional growth. We've been flat on retail for the time being. And I think 26 and hopefully 27, there'll be much more growth in retail, because what the institutions do is when they enter into a market is they bring a certain level of stability and predictability. And I think that's important, because this asset, being so new as it was, is volatile, which means that, like with any segment that's volatile, people get a little bit worried or scared because they don't understand it, right? Even though volatility is all over and everywhere around us, especially this year, right? And it doesn't have to be related to crypto, and it doesn't have to be related to the stock market. Just generally, life has been volatile in one form or the other, right? But people have difficulty sort of measuring it and sort of equating it that way. So institutions understand it much better, and they have mechanisms in which they can hedge themselves, which retail doesn't understand, right? So there are a lot of topics there, but generally speaking, I would say I'd give it an 8 out of 10 for institution, and I'd give it a 5 out of 10 for sort of retail adoption, which to me though is the opportunity, right? Because retail is really what we want here.
Right. Okay. Well, that's very interesting. Let's dig into that a little bit more. I mean, we're talking about property rights, and if you have abstracted, go back in timeline and history, John Locke. If you look at it from the America's founding lens, or if you go much further back and how property rights were developed or established. And now we're talking about digital property rights, and more specifically for consumers. Institutions might have different interpretations of that. As far as consumers are concerned, what should it mean to a user or consumer when we say digital property rights, when we get so excited about it?
Yeah. So maybe going back to the lens of sort of the origins of property rights and why that functions, right? So first, when you think about us when we used to be hunter-gatherer societies, we were typically, if you look at Dunbar's number, I think it's like 150. But generally speaking, most societies were sort of below 150 people because of the fact that you had oversight. You could manage the society without a leader. It's the other thing. Many of those hunter-gatherer societies didn't have tribal leaders. There wasn't like a king of that particular tribe. It was generally quite decentralized, right? And it worked because the society was small enough that everyone knew what everyone had. So if you had a cow, everyone knew it was your cow. There was not generally a dispute as to whose cow it was, because of the 150 people, 140 knew it was your cow, and so it's okay, right? But when you start reaching to, let's say, 100,000 people or even 10,000 people, the fact is that the people in one side of the city have no idea whether it's your cow. They don't know how to do that. So you needed some form of centralized control to be able to sort of augment and say, this is your cow, or this is your property, or this is your house. And so you had to do this record keeping. And this record keeping really advanced when we had the written word. When we were able to write things down, we could then have a record. And that record would then be enforced by some power. And the power tends to be centralized, which typically was held in the hands of a king who could enforce that power, right? And on it went, right? And why it was important is because through this capital asset, because it's your property, you now have the ability to transfer it, to trade it, to do commerce, right? And that's really, really important because society basically functions on this trade and commerce. To me, trade and really money has been the biggest form of social communications from a sort of growth and innovation standpoint. If it wasn't for the invention of money, we would not have societies come together. If it wasn't for the Silk Road, right, we wouldn't have sort of, cultures transcend to each other and communicate and trade. And if we didn't have the World Trade Organization and global trade, we wouldn't be here today. We wouldn't be communicating the way that we are and do that kind of stuff. Despite the fact that, a lot of people are like, maybe some people are anti-globalization, the reality is that we still trade with each other, right? Trade is a universal social language, I would argue, in some form or another, right? So, but to do that trade with one another, you must first own the property in question to trade. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be a house, it could be a car, it could be a cow, it could be items of any good, right? But if I don't have that property, if it's not mine, then it's not mine to begin with to trade, to begin with to engage with. I don't have rights to it, and if I don't have rights to it, then I don't own nothing. And if I want to go even a bit more philosophical, what is the very first thing that we get to own as a property? It is our name. So when you think of our history, of our identity, most of us were slaves, right? We were not anointed by kings, and we were not sort of God, as it were, right? So that means that many of us don't actually ever. I mean, if you look at your genealogy, why do so many have the same last name, right? Like I think in China we have maybe like 20 or 30 last names. I'm not sure about India, but you go to Korea, sometimes we joke and say, I think your last name is Kim, right? And you kind of go, and I grew up in Europe, right? And the names of the last names of families are based on either the town they were from or the profession they used to be. Like, you were the butcher, or you were the, you dealt with flowers, or like you were given the last names of areas around you because you didn't have a last name, because we were actually the property of someone else. Like we were slaves, we were serfs. And then when we started having last names, we actually owned the very first thing. We owned ourselves as a start, right? And I think this is where, when you talk about John Locke, when he says, basically the work of our hands, what he really means is that the sort of labor with the work of our hands is ultimately ours, right? In that sense that, if I pluck the apple, right, the fruits of the labor of owning the apple is now my property because I garnered it. But of course, I need to own the land in which that sort of apple can grow, right? So this activity basically gives me the property to then trade and sell, right? That's obviously, a 16th, 17th century's construction of property, right? But today, what is the property of that is important? And it is no longer the property of our hands, it is the property of our minds, right? If you think about the sort of creators, musicians, artists, in fact, the fastest growing asset class today, larger than gold, is intellectual property, right? If you think about the biggest companies in the world, it's all IP, right? It's about an $80 trillion market compared to gold's $27 trillion market, right? That doesn't even include the companies involved, just the value of the IP, intellectual property, patent rights, trade secrets, all that type of stuff. And all of this comes from our mind, right? It's things that we invented, we created, arguably out of nothing, but obviously created huge, huge value as a result. And so that is a property we need to protect. And I think a lot of people take that for granted. So if you're an inventor and you own a patent, good for you, right? But if you don't own the inventions of your creations, even for a limited period, then you don't have the ability to benefit from that, right? And I think that's the point why digital property rights is important, because today we spend so much more time digitally than we spend it in the analog world. And all of the value, and this is the big point that we keep trying to make, is all of the value you make online actually is digital value to which you own no property. So for instance, all the attention that you're generating on your Instagram post and your social media is creating a lot of value for Facebook and TikTok and Google. And how much do you get paid for it? Nothing, because it's not yours, right? So you just ended creating value for their property because it is their land, as it were, that you're developing, right? It is their data that you're enhancing. Data is the new asset class of which network effects form, which then become highly valuable. And so our point is that you need to basically own a slice of that value. Of course, by itself, it doesn't mean anything, but you're generating that value. I mean, if every user stopped using Instagram, what's the value of Instagram? Zero. So therefore, it stands to reason that Instagram users should receive a share in the value it's receiving. That value is in the form of digital advertising, and digital advertising today is about $800 billion a year, which is massive, right? And yet nobody gets to own a claim in it, even those who make the content, although it is the platform that makes that benefit. But I want to, just before we close on this, the one important other aspect of this is most people can understand it more simply in terms of creators. So I talked about content as creation for like even social media posts, but we understand music, we understand film, we understand art.
Yeah.
These are three more, let's call it, or authors, right? These are three more sort of, let's call them older versions of, I guess, creator economies. And the reason why they work and they grew and created more wealth is because they had property rights. So they're in the, I think, 17th century, there was one of the very first copyright acts that came out called the Statute of Anne. And the Statute of Anne was basically giving rights to authors as opposed to publishers, saying, hey, you wrote the book, that's actually your authorship. And that gave the author, for a limited period of time, the right to essentially commercialize his work. And then that's when you had the explosion, not only of some authors, but actually scientific writers, philosophers. They all emerged because now there was money to be made, right? If I'm a scientist, I can sort of write something and I could make money from this book. And if it's popular or true, then more people would want it, but they'd have to pay me a fee, right? So the discovery itself became that. And that's what we do today with IP and trademarks. If you didn't have music rights, there would be no Michael Jackson, there would be no Taylor Swift, there would be no Beatles, because there was no commercial rights attached to it, right? So that's basically what it means when I talk about property rights. And an extension of that, digital property rights, is because all of our time is digital. We need to own those rights. And I think once people understand that, then there's no going back.
Right. Okay. If I would sort of crystallize this whole property rights stack as identity, ownership, and distribution, broadly along those, and of course, the ownership can lead to, for example, even when one's data is being used for, let's say, training AI, and you've spoken about that as well. Okay, it comes in there. But if I were to look at this stack, so just solving one or two of these is not good enough. The entire stack needs to be fixed, and whether a decentralized design is the right way, which all of us in this space clearly believe, or not, is one of the sort of question marks. But you had first-hand experience of how that last part of the stack, the distribution side, in spite of having identity and ownership, can completely derail you.
Oh, yes, of course.
With the app.
Yeah. I mean,
So
I think you're talking about our experience with Apple, right?
that's right. So I want, of course, please do sort of delve into that.
Yes.
But at the same time, if you look at this stack, how do we fix digital property rights overall?
So first, just sharing the experience. In 2012, we were one of the biggest app store developers in the world at the time. So it's early days, of course, right? And we had hundreds of apps on the App Store. And in early 2012, Apple deplatformed us and removed every single one of our apps. They never gave us an official explanation. They just took it off. And we suspect it's because we figured out a way how to growth hack the App Store. But of course, they said it was a breach of rules, but they didn't tell us why or how to whatever. And the point isn't why they deplatformed us, because they never gave us a full reason. The point is that they were able to do so. And basically, theoretically, if this was a rule of law, right, and we were owning a property in a house, let's say somewhere in the world, then they effectively evicted us, right? And so if someone evicts you, you need to have good reason. And normally in society, you have the court of law. Hey, you kicked me out of my home. Let's go talk about this in court. Or, you infringed on my property rights or my contractual rights. Well, let's talk about it. But right now, the terms of service of all these agreements are such that you own nothing, right? So when you launch an app on the App Store, you take a platform risk, right? And that story is everywhere. I mean, if you think about Zynga, almost lost its entire business because Facebook decided, ooh, you guys are growing too fast, don't like that. And they changed the rules on Zynga, and suddenly Zynga had no business on Facebook anymore, when it was in fact something like 70 or 80 or maybe 90% of the business at the time, right? So you have all these sorts of decisions that are really, really, you can't essentially be beholden to the power of a despot, which is the next point I'm making. Why do these property rights and these rules have to be separated? I want to share a story around the music industry, around ASCAP. ASCAP was designed in sort of the middle 20th century as a way to protect music.
Sorry, what's that?
ASCAP. So ASCAP was basically designed to protect against music theft, in terms of people just literally on radio and stuff like that, stealing other people's music and just broadcasting it on their shows. Because, back in the 50s and 60s, radio was everywhere, right? Like everyone just literally came up with a radio channel, and they would just take music from some famous artist, and they said, wait, hold on, like everyone's ripping off my music. It wasn't like the ripping off MP3s, right? It was like literally airwave piracy, as you might call it. And then they organized the musical, the Songwriters Association. All those guys came together and started a thing called ASCAP. And ASCAP's role was really to go and basically enforce royalties to everyone, which they did very effectively. And there was a little bit of a golden age where musicians and artists were all getting paid, because they went to every one of those stations and said, hey, you got to pay us, right? And so they did. They paid them. But then ASCAP got too powerful. And because they centralized all the royalty rights suddenly, right? And suddenly they started to dictate musicians what they should be doing, until they were broken up through anti-monopolistic practices as a essentially charity organization. You could almost, but an NGO, right? I mean, that's basically what happens when you centralize power, right? And today we have this in the case of Spotify. While it's not a NGO, Spotify is effectively the sort of artist's essentially agent of the world in some form or fashion. And there's not a single musician in the world that actually really makes a living through selling music on Spotify, right? So Spotify has become a promotion and distribution platform, but yet Spotify basically makes billions and billions of dollars of revenues, off the work of others, right? And so it goes back to this old adage, basically, sort of absolute power corrupts absolutely, and that always seems to be the case, right? So that's the argument as to why you don't want centralized control of anything, right? And especially when it comes to your property. There is a reason why property in a true democracy has a premium, and a property in a full, let's call it kleptocracy or dictatorship, has often a discount. And the reason why is because someone higher up can decide, I changed my mind, you shouldn't have it. So there's a risk discount. Whereas if you have a property in somewhere in Europe or somewhere in America or in Hong Kong or whatever it is around the world, where property rights are sort of I guess almost God-given and sacrosanct, right? Then you can have the assurance that okay, I buy this property, I can give it, I know that it's mine, and I'm willing to pay essentially 20 or 30 years forward for that because of the fact that I know that me or my children can use it, all that kind of stuff, right? So property rights are very, very important in order to sort of do that. And the other part for society, before we even go as to what it means in other areas, is that if you don't have property rights, then it's very hard for individuals, especially in a capitalist framework, to invest long term. Imagine if I want to develop a business and I knew that I only had 6 months before the rules changed, or 1 year. What happens? You start thinking 6 months or 1 year or 3 months. You're not thinking about investing into something that might have a framework that might be 10 years or 20 years. You can't think long term anymore because it's not yours to think long term. If you don't have long term, you won't have research. You won't have development cycles. You won't have any of that type of stuff if you knew that the work you're doing basically wouldn't be protected in one form or fashion. So it's actually quite important for intellectual property protection and for essentially the development of nations, I would argue, right? Your idea spaces and so forth, right? So there is that part. So the decentralization of that assures that. The final point I would say, when you think about the future, when you trade these assets and these items, because they're intellectual property of some form, you want to be able to do it in a way in which there is no centralized power that can change the rules. And I think that this is even more certain in areas when you look at it, like AI agents. So AI agents are the ones who are going to be sort of handling essentially tokenized assets, because it's essentially the native asset class of AI. Would you rather AI have API access to basically sort of closed systems and transact? Or do you want to have the assurance that whatever it's transacted with actually is truly theirs at the time of transaction? And if you're in AI, actually, you'd want to rather choose the decentralized asset than the centralized asset. And you can very much imagine this just in the form of Bitcoin versus basically sort of using sort of, let's call it, money trading that's sitting inside some, centralized outfit. The centralized outfit could deplatform you, right? But if it's your Bitcoin and you can trade with it, then essentially it's in your custody and you can use it and you can do stuff with it on chain and nobody can take it away from you and you have that assurance. And it's okay when you're transacting $100, $500, maybe even tens of thousands of dollars. But if you're doing $100 million, right, or tens of millions of dollars, do you really want to sort of entrust that future into something and into something private? And this is why regulation has come in, right? So regulation has come in governments to say, okay, you as a private corporation have become too powerful. So we're going to go in and create rules that you can't abuse that power, right? But what if we told you there was a way in which power couldn't be abused anyway? That's decentralization, right? Blockchain technology. Then essentially you scale that and you don't need the government sort of overhang in the same way. Not that you don't need regulation, but you don't need that type of regulation anymore because the blockchain takes care of that for you already, right? So I would also say that you then have much more participation as well. It's kind of what we saw with open source. So broadly speaking, decentralization is always better than centralization when it comes to more mature stages. But there is, of course, a benefit to be centralized in the beginning because it helps you coordinate better. You get more speed, you get more efficiency, right? And I think my point is that they're not mutually exclusive, right? You can't. It's not like people often look at China and they say, oh, it's centralized, that's why it works so well. The economy is completely decentralized, right? Like when people do business over there, it's not like the government approves anything per se, right? Yeah. So there is a level where you do need to have some control, but there's another level where you keep it decentralized, and then essentially the ecosystem flourish. If it wasn't for decentralization, we wouldn't have half the growth that we're seeing in the world today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You actually touched upon something that I am building at Arna, which is an agentic on-chain treasury, but managing capital on-chain with an agentic framework for treasuries, and we'll come to that. But centralization versus decentralization. I'm sat here in Singapore. Another great example of how centralized power in the right forms can do wonders for a nation state. But we all know that the pitfalls are far larger as well, especially when you scale it up. So we've seen that across history, and there are arguments which are very strong in favor of decentralization. Now, sort of again going back to that stack, and at the beginning of that identity, and your vision of Mocaverse, or sort of, and beginning with identity, and it's largely to do with the gaming space right
No,
now,
I mean
but is
it's much broader than that. I mean, we started with gaming obviously because gaming is also a reputation stack, but really it comes down to what is the most perhaps what is the most important property right that you care about? It's probably your reputation, right? Right. At the end of the day, reputation is something that stacks. You build it over time, and it's hard to build and easy to lose. So people do a lot to try to protect it. And it's not just in relation to honor, it's in relation to sort of business or opportunities or, in your society, in your work, with your friendships, in your relationships. Reputation actually means everything, right? And whereas you could argue that even transactions in and of themselves, like, buying a property or doing something, is only sort of a measure to build up your reputation. And, while there are people obviously who think of money as a way to transact, to do, let's say, something that might hurt their reputation, but they want to benefit. They end up spending a lot of money later on to recover that reputation. Okay, right. So anyway, so it's basically to say that I think most people care about reputation, and reputation is essentially our most important property that we take within all of our life, and perhaps even beyond. I mean, as we get older, what do we talk about? We talk about our legacy. Oh, what is your legacy? It's your reputation that you've done, what you've done for society that you want to pass on in eternity, so to speak, right? So again, it is. Again, I would argue, it's much more. It's much more valuable than say, like the piece of house that you can no longer live in after you're gone, right? So but moving away a little bit from the philosophical, it's around essentially creating more trust in the ecosystem. And how do you create more trust in the ecosystem? And not just in crypto, but basically in society. It's basically your reputation. The reason I can walk into a bookstore and read at books and browse it, and then go to the store and buy it afterwards, after browsing and experiencing it, is because we live in a high trust society, right? That high trust society knows that people entering my bookstore have at least enough reputation that they're not going to go just steal the books, right? And then when you go to a store, unfortunately, in San Francisco or in Los Angeles, go to a local CVS and you see everything's locked up that is of a certain value, that's a low trust society where people are like, okay, they're going to steal something, and so I can't stop that. So I have to basically do that. Where would you rather live? And what's conducive? What environment is more conducive for growth of business and opportunity, right? Clearly, high trust societies do better, and that's also something that is proven, at least in terms of research and analysis, that the more trust exists in society, interpersonal trust, the higher the GDPs are, because you can trade and do business with each other in a much more safer way. So what does crypto need? It needs high trust, because we've had a little bit of a conflation of privacy versus anonymity, and we've conflated them.
Yeah.
But we've conflated them intentionally, depending on who you talk to. Right, so if you're basically someone who benefits from essentially, or sort of really being, I would argue, somewhat negative to the ecosystem because you're extractive,
Yes.
you want anonymity, right? Privacy is not really what you want. You want anonymity, but you call it privacy because it sounds better, right? I wanted to keep my stuff private and whatever, right? But it's not that we care about privacy in society. And we care about privacy. We care about privacy in society. We don't care about anonymity. In fact, we don't want anonymity, right? If it's pure anonymity, that essentially means like you're doing business with a stranger every single day. You have no idea who that person is. Can you imagine, going to the, you're a baker or your restaurant, and every guest that goes in is a new person that you just simply never saw before ever, right? Or you're going around in your local community and nobody ever because everyone's
Yeah.
anonymous all the time, right? That's not it, right? You want to know this person. You just don't need to know everything about him, right? Right? That's how society functions. That's how we have trust. And we need the same framing in crypto. We need privacy. So I don't know everything about you. I don't need to know how much money you have or where you live, but I know that I can trust you because you've been to the store many times, or you've been a good paying customer, or that kind of stuff. And so how do you scale that trust? This is where zero knowledge proofs and blockchain technology is awesome, because now you can scale that trust. Right now, how do we get trust for credit? We go to a credit agency and they basically get data from third parties to say, hey, this guy, you can give him a loan. That's one way of doing this, but it's not available for everyone to see. And it's not reasonable for me to go into a bakery and then the bakery has to analyze my credit rating to see whether I should be able to buy bread. Right? Right? However, imagine if this data, without knowing the credit rating, just enough to say, hey, this guy's a good customer. You don't need to know that he's paid his debt for the last 20 years. You just need to know that he's got a high score. That's all you got to know, right? And then you go and say, I can do business with him. In fact, he might buy the bread now and pay me later because I trust you, for instance, right? Or I can begin to engage with you more specifically because I know that you have something to lose in society as well, right? So we need that in crypto. Digital identity solves that, and it can preserve your privacy, but essentially sort of take away, I would argue in some ways, sort of this sort of dark shadow of anonymity. I'm not saying being anonymous is not a good thing in certain circumstances, but I think we've taken anonymity to the wrong extreme. And it's given crypto a bad name because everyone's like, oh, he's anonymous. You don't know who he is. So he could be a thief, or he could be from one of those hackers in North Korea, right? And that's not what we're about. It's not what society is about.
Yeah. No, I couldn't sort of agree more. Crypto bros defend anonymity to the hilt, but I think we clearly conflate privacy and anonymity. And I think anonymity for the sake of it is a definite net negative for the ecosystem of crypto. It's we talk about a trustless design, and we introduce lack of trust with this form of anonymity.
Exactly. And I think when you have a reputation system with Mocha ID, we basically focused on building essentially this reputation score. Over time, basically, that becomes an asset in itself. In the same way that, if you have an Amazon seller or buyer rating, that is an asset. If you have an Uber rating, that is an asset, right? If you were able to move that score in other areas of your business or your work life, right, that is certified, that's valuable, right? It's not just valuable because customers might do business with you. It's also valuable for your reputation. For instance, if you have a high gaming score in Steam, why shouldn't you be able to move that gaming score into another game and get credits for that? Because then they know, oh, okay, you're a committed player, or you're good at that skill, or that kind of stuff, right? So it functions in all aspects of life, right? Right now, when we are in the digital space, this is the other thing about sort of, I guess, borders or lack of borders, right? Typically, when we go to a new country, we start from scratch, right? Classic immigrant story, but that's normal because all the ties, all those credit scores, all the reputation you built up, which is, by the way, the reason why people often don't leave their countries, despite being at the brink of war and disaster, because they're like, well, I'm giving everything up. You lose your house, but I'm giving everything up. You're giving up your reputation, your friends, your network. That seems so valuable. It is, right? And then you go somewhere else and you start from scratch. Right now, we're asking everyone in the digital world to do this every single time you go to a new platform. That's ridiculous, right? You should be able to share that score around. But the thing is that the platforms have figured out that owning your rating, owning your identity is how I make sure you never leave. Right? So, because it's right. And so this is why you need decentralized digital identity as a way to reclaim that so that it is now your identity, it is your score, it is your reputation that you can take everywhere in the world as you wish and please.
Okay. If I were to extend this into a very direct use case, let's take DeFi lending borrowing markets.
Sure, of course, on-chain credit, yeah.
Yeah, on-chain credit, where credit is accessed with over-collateralized assets, as we know it today, right? Now, yes, today. So, do you foresee a situation where we've got a Mocha ID or any such form, which not just is your reputation in sort of in a social context in the metaverse, but also your sort of a credit score of sorts. Now, with
Absolutely.
that,
Absolutely.
could you borrow in an on-chain market with collateral which is far lower than what we are doing right now, for example?
100%. So the opening and how do you create, so we care about mass adoption, right? So how do you create this mass adoption? You have to include people into the ecosystem. You don't include people into the financial ecosystem by asking them to over collateralize, right? You're taking a chance on them, right? You're saying, okay, here's a loan or here's a credit for you. Here's a credit card, right? That you can spend because I think you're good for it to pay back over a certain period of time. I sometimes give this example about employment. Right? Imagine if you go and work for a company and you say, oh, great. So you can join here, but I need you to put up at least 1 year of your salary as collateral, so I can, make sure that you're productive, right? Right? Because I don't have a reputation. I don't know who you are, right? And if you did that, I'm sure we'd hire that person because at least you give it a chance, right? Or at least most people will. But the problem is that it doesn't work this way, right? So what you do is you invest it in your reputation by going to college or by doing other things to say, hey, I have the skill, so take a chance. But how many people hire someone on that chance and it works out? It doesn't always work out, but it's part of that process, right? It's part of that evolution and part of that design, right? Now, the thing that we do on Mocha Token a lot is these airdrops, right? These airdrops essentially, from our vantage point, is the equivalent of essentially providing unsecured credit. Now, it's not to say that it's unsecured credit because we want it back. It's just to say that, hey, you have a good score and we'll give you the tokens because we think you'll do good things with it. That is already the first generation of that approach. It's to say, I'm paying you because I hope you will do good things. And if you do bad things with them, eventually we won't give you any more, right? Because we don't think that you're basically a good actor, right? That's an equivalent version of essentially on-chain credit. You can now advance that further into essentially creating unsecured credit. And unsecured credit is a multi-trillion-dollar market. And if we could actually create unsecured credit on-chain, then we could open that market much, much larger and actually creates more liquidity and more growth and more opportunities because there's no need to over-collateralize. And also, if you over-collateralize, you actually make it harder for people to join the ecosystem because you just don't have the money to do so, right? Right. It's so I think it's all related towards that. And eventually, once you have a society where everyone has a reasonable trust score of some sort that they can measure, they can choose to not share it, right, up to them, then we'll have not only more sort of unsecured credit as a whole, which is more inclusive, we're also going to have a lot more trade and transactions because I have more trust, right? If I can trust you, I can do it much more easily as opposed to needing all these, like how much friction do we have because we have to KYC 5 times over, right? And have to sort of do verification checks 10 times over, right? As opposed to, okay, actually, the ID can solve for a lot of that. And so you can now transact much faster. It's all about removing friction and making it more seamless.
Right. Okay. And yeah, if I were to ask you, and we started off by talking about where digital property rights are today, but where you would have liked to see them by now. By when do you think a Mocha ID would be able to enable transactions like these in the world of DeFi?
So for Animoca, the institutional roadmap that we have, what we do, for instance, with our joint venture with Standard Chartered and Hong Kong Telecom, with Anchor Point, or what we're doing with Nuva on the RWA marketplace and so on, it's all around helping build out that vision. These are all pieces of the puzzle that fit together. So we think within the next sort of, let's call it, this process where we're going to have a lot more adoption in this area might take about 2 years. But I say 2 years, not because we don't have adoption right now, but because you need to get to a certain threshold on chain. So right now we have about 500 million people in the world that own crypto, but maybe less than 20, perhaps even just, let's call it 10% plus that actually are on chain. So the full benefits of what blockchain and crypto can offer to the end user is still small. And so that's the audience today that basically would benefit from digital identity. I mean, of course, you can use it in an exchange, and of course, you can use it in a centralized platform. That's what we're doing with SK Telecom and those guys as well. But really, the full benefits come when you basically go on chain. So you need to bring more people on chain. So to me, the trigger of that growth will come when we have significant more numbers in on chain, which would be probably around 150 to 200 million people on chain active, which means we need to be at least at about 1 billion people who own crypto. And so if I was to project this, our assumptions is that in the next 12 to 24 months, we're going to get 1 billion people in crypto, then we will basically hit that kind of escape velocity. We're already doing a version of this, of course, at smaller scale with student loans, right? So a company we finance, Pencil Finance and Open Campus, through the EDU chain ecosystem, essentially is offering student loans on chain for primarily Philippines and Indonesia for the time being, right? And that's actually an interesting evolution and development from that as well. And that, again, helps build your credit score. But it's kind of, let's call it a hybrid sort of on-chain digital entity score, because, of course, it pays out into the physical world to the universities in question. And there's a score that's attributed as well and uses those credit scores as well. But I guess we'll have to go through those evolutions as well. Eventually, all those scores that are analog are ultimately going to come on-chain because it's safer and more secure. And I want to highlight one other point around sort of what happens when you have zero-knowledge proofs on digital identity, which essentially they become legally compliant. Because one of the biggest problems around digital identity is your data, right? Who owns the data? Oh, if you're the platform, you have to manage the data. So are you responsible, right? And the problem is so many small companies actually can't do business because they can't deal with the burden, take Europe and GDPR as an example, of all the data compliance purposes. So as a small business, you're locked out. Who wins? The big guys, right? But if you have a technology where the data actually sovereignly is owned by the end user and you do not have custody of the data, then you can now service them with the same principles without the same liabilities. And it means you can see much more innovation and growth in the areas of expanding the use cases of digital identity and this type of things like on-chain credit. It's the same as we see, for instance, with blockchain technology and Ethereum, for instance. People are building on-chain primitives that are financial in nature, but they don't have the same issues because it's their assets, right? And they can build on banking-grade infrastructure without having to sort of host and maintain and own it, right? So you can create much more innovation in the field, as we've seen with DeFi.
Yeah. No, totally sort of, once you step back and take a look at that view, getting 100 million on chain and, abstracting the complexity at multiple levels. For example, DeFi is so degen right now, unless we abstract that complexity, even crypto folks, less than 10% are on chain. And so multiple levels of abstracting that complexity away, starting with identity and how people access capital, how the whole flow happens. I think once you step back and take that macro view, there's just so much that's possible. But I guess every now and then we get struck with headwinds in various forms, be it regulation, be it markets, be it quantum threatening Bitcoin right now. So one wonders, but I think directionally it just seems so much of an obvious pathway.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the other thing also, I mean, we say this a lot, right? Is, regardless of the uncomfortableness you have with, let's say, the implied volatility in the market, at the end of the day, if you don't tokenize, the business that you're competing with that is tokenizing is going to kill you, right? That's the thing, right? So it's kind of like the same in the early days of the internet, which is that you could choose not to be online. Just the guy who is online is probably going to kill you. You could choose not to be on Instagram, but the company that is on Instagram will probably kill you. Right? It's the same trend. It doesn't change, right? And I think and frankly, even if you're uncertain, I think it's foolish for a company not to explore it deeply and understand it, because disruptive technology is everywhere. And one of the things that we say to people is that the best hedge towards AI is actually to tokenize. Because the likelihood that you will have an advantage over someone else using AI technology is minuscule. I'm not to say it's going to be normal. It's like, what's the advantage of someone who's on Instagram versus another company? Not much of an advantage, but you just have to be, right? It's like back in the days, you had to be in the telephone book. If you weren't in the telephone book, right? If you weren't in the yellow pages, you weren't found. Right? It doesn't matter whether you're big or small. You had to be there, right? And so the competitive advantage of AI, when you're all using similar tools and make different things, won't be that great. So what's the best hedge? Well, basically use the assets that AI is going to use, right? Right? And that's for most of us. Again, for some others, of course, they can take advantage and they're very good at it and whatever. Right? And so really, it's sort of, I would argue we're at an era where it's tokenize or die, certainly in the next coming years.
Okay. And I guess at Animoca, you're kind of really well poised and have very exciting times coming up with the reverse merger.
Yes.
Let's talk about that. What's been your motivation for going through that route and accessing public capital markets?
Yeah, I mean, so very quickly, I would say that when you look at Animoca, we think we are perhaps the best gateway to the altcoin economy. So it starts with the very first thesis point, which and it relates to AI, of course, right? But the thesis point being that we believe that altcoins are the fastest growth vehicle in the entire crypto space over the frankly short to mid, even longer term. And we think that ultimately, collectively, altcoin is going to exceed the value of Bitcoin, which it isn't the case now. It's like roughly, less than half of Bitcoin. Well, it depends which day you look at, but something along those lines, right? And the reason we say that is because altcoin is what everyone's using. Everyone's using altcoin products. Everyone's adopting basically and going into crypto because of altcoins. And altcoins isn't just stable coins and Ethereum and Solana. It's your gaming token. It's your entertainment token. It's your utility token. It's your gas token. That's what we use. We don't use Bitcoin. Bitcoin is digital gold, right? It's a store of value, and it's a reserve asset. But we use everything else in the space. And if you look at, for instance, the stock market today, it's 128 trillion compared to gold, 27 trillion. That we think is about the right ratio. But then if you also even add the private markets, that's another 80, 90 trillion. Then actually really gold and relative to, let's call it the utility sort of services in the world is about 10 times ratio difference. And I think altcoins will ultimately move in that direction. However, if you're an investor, how are you going to know which altcoins to buy? How do you know sort of what ecosystem will grow? And how do you participate at the earliest level? And so this is where Animoca has a structural advantage, both as an investor and an advisor and a participant and supporter of launching these projects, right? And so we think that we've basically created effectively one of the most powerful indexes in that growth space. And so if you're going to believe in crypto and you say this is an asset class I must have exposure, you probably need to have Bitcoin, and probably the majors like Ethereum, Solana, and that kind of stuff. Maybe some Circle, Coinbase stock, that type of stuff. And then how do you have everything else, which is the fastest growing segment? And so we think Animoca is the company to do that. So for the time being, we think we're the only ones that can do that. But we're not a public company as listed yet. And so that's why going in this way makes sense. Now, why do we choose to do a merger as opposed to a straight IPO? Some of it is, of course, timing related, but the merger with Currency, a fintech player, makes sense because they essentially service millions of customers in Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, and those places right now for payment rails. So it's perfect for a crypto use case, right? So this is a strategic merger. This isn't specifically just sort of, like some people say, oh, it's a shell. It's not a shell at all in that sense. There's actually a lot of strategic synergies that we can develop on top of that. And the final point is educating the markets. So a lot of people remember Animoca Brands as gaming and Metaverse, which is one part of what we do. But we're much more than that now, right? With a portfolio of over 628 essentially sort of crypto and Web3 projects that are basically all going to have a token, or most of them will have a token in one form or the other, in which you get exposure in that ecosystem. And then we create yield and that type of stuff, right? And so now we have this period where over the next 9 to 12 months, I can talk about our business and explain it, and people can understand it. When you're in this period where you're negotiating a deal like this, you have a quiet period. I can't say anything. So that means I wasn't even allowed to properly pitch the business and explain sort of, why it all matters, because I didn't have a platform for it, and I wasn't really allowed to, and now I am, right? So I think that's a mixture of things. So it's a mixture of educating, awareness, market opportunity, scale and size, and of course the target in question. I mean, if it was not this target, we probably would have waited as well, because it just made a lot of sense.
All right. No, all the very best for that. I'm sure that's going
Thank
to be panning out.
It'll be a roller coaster, I'm sure.
Yeah. No, in crypto, it's not no fun if it's not a roller coaster. It has to be. But sort of again, Animoca, when you look at the construct, and especially now, I believe your the digital advisory side is churning out the maximum revenues for the company right now. So you've got this whole hybrid company. You've got gaming as a sort of foundation in many ways. Then you got the VC or ventures, which has gone into more than 500 plus projects. Then you've got the advisory side, closely related, but still sort of different. Now, how do you explain all of this to TradFi markets and investors, leave alone crypto investors?
Yeah, I mean, I go back to basically talking about the fact that we are your altcoin gateway, essentially. Your sort of best operational levered bet to enter essentially this altcoin space, this altcoin market. So from an investor standpoint, it doesn't really matter if you know how we generate the altcoins. So things like advisory, market making, treasury services, investing, these are all levers that we use to essentially get altcoins at the best possible value that we can, and then basically help grow the ecosystems and of course grow the space so that we grow our value as well, right? That's the mechanism. But as you as a company, if you said, hey, you're going to do some advisory to help accumulate more altcoin positions 3 years ago, I was like, what? Like, I didn't know, right? So the point is that the business as we are today is going to keep evolving, right? I mean, who would have thought that we would be doing something like a joint venture with Standard Chartered and Hong Kong Telecom? Or who would have thought that we were going to do an RWA marketplace with, with basically the team at Figure, 3 years ago? Like, you wouldn't have known that, right? And we wouldn't have known, or that we would be doing student loans, right? You're like these are things that you would not have been able to know 3 years ago because the business constantly evolves. I tell people a lot, like, Amazon, they're that bookseller, right? Okay, right? They sold books, and they still sell books, but they're much more than that, right? Right? And so, and Google, I mean, it's not just search; it's a lot more than that, right? And Apple, not just selling computers, right? So every one of those companies evolve based on where the market needs them to grow, and you can't look at sort of the snapshot of who you once were, which I think is death, right? The moment you start identifying with, oh, this is what we once were, look at the glory days, you're done. I mean, it's a little bit the problem you have with Europe, for instance, a little bit like, oh, we were once this. No, you're not. And maybe you were then, but it doesn't matter, right? Time moves forward, not backwards. Okay, right? So I think there's that element that's really critical, that you're basically always moving forward and being ready for altering and changing. But what does not change is our ultimate desire to essentially be accumulating as much of these altcoins that are valuable and important in the sort of mid to long term. And then we become the perfect vehicle for that, we think. So I want to share a story back in the 90s, and let's call it early 2000s. I was an early internet entrepreneur in Hong Kong. I was kind of penniless, so I didn't have much money. Although my small angel investments that I did ended up making, in many ways, more money than actually sort of my exit of that business to IBM. But what happened, right? What actually happened was that these companies grew so fast in what we understood, I understood as well, that were going to be massively transformative because the whole world was going to be on the internet. And while you couldn't necessarily tell what we would all be doing on the internet, broadly speaking, we're all going to be on the internet. And we're going to be doing stuff on the internet. And so it makes sense for us to basically be indexed towards that. Now imagine if you were a fund and you had the blessing of being invested in Google and in Apple and in Facebook and in Google in the early days. Let's call them 2000-ish, okay? Well, if you're a fund, you have to unwind the fund in 7 or 10 years. And you would have sat on amazing profits already in those 7 to 10 years. That would have been 2010, maybe 2012. Imagine how much value you had left on the table if you had to sell your stock of those companies in 2012. Already big companies, don't get me wrong, right? Yeah. But now they're trillion-dollar companies as opposed to billion-dollar companies, right? And that's basically how we think about altcoins as well. It would be ridiculous to think about selling everything right now. I'm not saying that there are that there are bad projects or not successful projects, of course, right? But in the lens of that growth, you want to be indexed across the entire space. And how are you going to do it? Maybe in a few years, your team will have the ability to just do that. Maybe you have your own VC team and you can do that. I do personally think that, for instance, corporate balance sheet investing is the way of the future. I think classic VC investing is troubled for that reason. You have more VC funds now saying, oh, evergreen, evergreen. But it's kind of a problem because if I have an evergreen fund, then when do I ever get an exit? when do I get out? There's a couple of funds I participated in that have that principle. And you never get an exit. You get a nice book value, but you're like, okay, what do I do with this? But if it's in the public market, if it's trading as a stock, then essentially
Yeah.
you have liquidity while you have growth as well. That to us seems like the right vehicle. That's why we want to go public.
Okay. All right. Now, it's your journey's been very fascinating. Building out Animoca, but even going much further back you were born in Vienna. Have seen through the world changing in many ways, quite like me as well. With we have these few gray hairs, and what's your sort of worldview of as you go to the the largest capital market? What's your worldview on capitalism and especially around stakeholder capitalism you spoke about? I'm a believer and a practitioner, I believe, of purpose capitalism, and I love that part because not very many people in this space of crypto, where it is hyper financialized, think beyond capitalism in any other lens. So we would love to hear about that.
Yeah, no, thank you. So first, it's an important and favorite topic of mine. So love to talk about it. So first of all, I think one of the reasons why crypto, and this is not just crypto, this is just broadly saw this in the early days of certainly development in China, probably America as well. Not sure, but I think India may be similar, right? When you're in a wealth sort of development phase, there's a period where you just accumulate because you feel like there's nothing, like you have to sort of, certainly my parents' generation would be of that type because they had nothing, like literally nothing, right? So suddenly you can make some money and save something. It's like literally, it's like a hamster hoarding for life, making the cheeks bigger and bigger because you have to. You just worry about rainy days because you were just always scared that you could lose it all, right? And this is what happens when you live in a live in a non-property rights framing. And that's also one of the reasons why immigrants around the world, particularly when you look at Chinese and Indian immigrants around the world, they typically sort of have this mode where they're very successful, typically keep to themselves, and also make sure they accumulate wealth because it's their defense, right? It's like, okay, you know what? So it's not, so, and this is a natural instinct of the circumstances of their time, right? But we no longer live in an era of that type of scarcity, right? Like my parents had to worry about food on the table. We don't have to worry about that. Our children certainly don't have to worry about that. I mean, unfortunately, in some places they do now, but generally speaking, we're in a better place societally than we were, say, 30 or 40 years ago. And so then what happens is that you had a system that was developing really over time, where we went from labor to essentially a more sort of capitalist world, but we didn't bring people along with us, and they didn't participate in the capitalist system. There's a stat around the world that says that there's less than 10% in the world that own property or have a stock portfolio of some sort. That's a staggering number. Now, of course, if you're in Hong Kong, New York, London, that's of course much higher. It's maybe even 50, 60, 70%. But in other places around the world, they don't. And so that means that you have a large swath of the world that owns nothing, right? Versus a small percentage of the world that owns everything. And that typically is the beginning of trouble historically, right? Land reformation, revolutions all come from this base idea that they don't, of gross inequity. And so how do you make sure that you have this sort of inequity solved? You can't solve it, we think, by giving everyone something, which is unfortunately I would say a classic political trope, because it's like, you should have this. Take money from the billionaires, give it to the other people. It's attractive sounding for someone who has nothing, but it actually becomes more destructive, as we know, right? But if you make them a participant in the system, then they have something at stake, then they'll fight for it. In other words, make everyone a capitalist is, we think, the answer. As opposed to giving money to others is not capitalism. That is an extreme form of socialism, right? Rather, we think it's better that they should become stakeholders. And that's what we call the stakeholder capitalism, where if more people are engaged, then they participate. So take Elon Musk's very controversial $1 trillion package, right? Why did he get shareholder approval on perhaps, arguably on at least the surface, the most ridiculous package in history, which is he gets paid trillions of dollars? Because part of the condition is that the company will be worth tens of trillions more, making every single shareholder in Tesla a millionaire. So the argument is, I'm okay for you to be super wealthy because you'll make me wealthy too. right? And this goes down to, actually, to me, not far away from, even some of the very earliest forms of Locke, right? When Locke talked about essentially sort of property rights and essentially labor of the labor of our hands, he spoke in the construct of, to make sure that there is good in common for others, as in basically don't take only, but when you take, you have enough for others to give, right? Right. And right now, the problem with capitalism in the shareholder construct, we strayed from that path where we just take and we don't give. Now, I don't mean to say give in a charity sense. That's I think we conflate that. We say, oh, when you give, you're giving charity. No, when you give, you're actually giving back into the ecosystem in different ways by enriching the people, part of the process of that growth, right? So if every shareholder in Tesla becomes a millionaire, then Elon will deserve his trillions, for instance. That's okay, because there is still, we can argue about ratio, but the point is that Elon would have created a common good broadly by making at least his shareholders more money, right? And that's the bargain we sign up for society as well. When we join and get born in society, we do our tasks, we do our jobs, and hopefully we will get to own our house and build a family, right? The social contract here says, I do my part and you do your part, and we'll all rise broadly together. And if some are more successful than others, that's okay. I'm not worse off as a result. Unfortunately, right now, it feels that we are worse off, and it's creating these narratives. Yeah. And why tokenization, we think, solves this is one of the inequities I think we have in in capitalism broadly, is access. It's not even whether, so it's education, but it's access. It's not even a case of, oh, maybe I do want to put, 5% of my salary into the company stock, right? Or into something, okay? But we don't even allow that possibility, right? And we have these funds, pension funds, that just take money from you. Like I have this, in Hong Kong, we very late enacted MPF, which is, the provider, basically it's like a 401k. I looked at the performance of the 401k. I had it for like 25 years or something, right? And it's like, I don't know, 10% up, 20% up, broadly flat. I don't know what it is. It's terrible, right? But that's because it's abuse, because there's a fund manager and he's just putting money safely. He gets paid on just managing your funds. He doesn't have to do anything to get reward for it, right? So again, that's an example of abuse. Whereas if I had put some of that money into tech companies of the era of that time, right, then I would have sat on much more substantial wealth and participated. And more importantly, because I'm a user of these, I actually should benefit from it because I make it grow. Like, for instance, if I'm an Instagram user and I help Instagram grow, I should own a stake in that. Or if I'm an Apple user and I promote Apple, I mean, how many people who out there own an Apple device and told their friends to buy Apple actually owned Apple stock, right? To me, these are things that really would make more sense. And then when I talk about putting money back in the ecosystem, let's take Apple. It's a favorite example of mine. If Apple took just a few percentage of their revenues or profit and made a seed Series A investment fund to only invest in companies that build on the App Store, that would be a fund that is larger than any seed fund ever, and it would make the App Store thrive. And more importantly, probably every App Store developer is happy to pay 30%. Yeah. Right? So to me, but it's still capitalism. You're still for profit, right? So you putting money back into your ecosystem is not a negative. It grows it. Yeah. And that's why at Animoca we make the investments that we do, because we're growing the ecosystem. So we grew because they grow. Because not only do their tokens grow as an ecosystem, but we participate broadly, as opposed to the classic zero-sum thinking of, I only concentrate my bet on one and they take everything, and a winner takes all scenario. But society doesn't function this way per se, right? Like imagine if the place you lived in was truly winner takes all. Well, then that would be a very sad place, and we may as well go back to feudalism, right? So I think we sort of are not in that kind of world, but we haven't got enough people to participate in that. But we need not just access, which tokenization solves, right? Because everyone could access it, right? But you also need financial literacy, which is the harder part, because even if you have access, why am I doing it? I don't understand. And that's why I think things like gaming and so on are important, because these are all storytelling tools that tell people, what is money? Why is it important? What is investing? And maybe the final point I would put out is, in a world of AI, where essentially most labor will go the way of AI, I actually think that you need to become essentially, creative and an investor in assets. I think everyone needs to become an investor to survive. If you've been an investor over the last 20, 30 years, you'd have been much better than if you were just purely labor, where you would probably be net negative now.
Yeah. Yeah, fascinating having this chat, and to this positive sum decentralized capitalism. Let's move forward to that. Awesome having you on Alpha Nasht, Yat Siu.
Thank you for having me. It's been a great pleasure.